Good evening, everyone. This is Jacqueline Luqman, and this is Brick by Brick. So I hope you all have been following me on this amazing series I've been doing on neoliberalism, the history of neoliberalism, what it is, what it means, what it's been in the United Kingdom and here in the United States, where it comes from and what it does. So we've covered a lot of ground in the past 4 weeks, and tonight I am going to get to what I promised I'd get to last week, which is to talk about the point at which the Democrats turn their backs on progressive groups and interests, labor, minorities, the disabled, women, all of the working class and the poor. Now, let's go over really quickly what neoliberalism is again, because I like to make sure people understand what we're talking about. Neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. It redefines citizens as consumers whose democratic choices are best exercised by buying and selling, a process that really rewards merit and punishes inefficiency. It rewards people who have the means to consume, and it punishes people who do not. Neoliberalism maintains that it's the market that delivers benefits that could never be achieved by planning, and planning basically means the government ensuring social equality, social justice, paying for social programs to ensure fairness in society. Neoliberalism looks at any attempts to limit competition like roadblocks to liberty. Tax and regulation should be minimized at all costs. Public services should be privatized. Regulations should be limited. Social programs should not receive a whole lot of spending, if any. The organization of labor and collective bargaining by trade unions are portrayed as market distortions that impede the formation of a natural hierarchy of winners and losers. Inequality is recast as virtuous because the reward for utility and a generator of wealth is more wealth, which, according to neoliberals, trickles down to enrich everyone. They really do believe that the market will just automatically take care of everyone underneath the layer of very few winners at the top. Any efforts to create a more equal society are both counterproductive, seen as counterproductive, and morally corrosive, because neoliberals believe that the market ensures that everyone gets what they deserve. So, as we said, the neoliberal playbook includes implementing massive deregulation policies, the privatization of public services, and reducing funding to the public and social services that remain. And before 1970, the U.S. enjoyed a great deal of economic success under what we've talked about before as Keynesian New Deal policies. Racial disparities aside, because that honestly is an entire new and separate series, which I'm going to do, the American middle class was built off of the Keynes-crafted policies of the New Deal under FDR. Maynard Keynes did architect the New Deal policies. But in the 1970s, when Keynesian policies began to fail, at least that's the narrative we're told, and economic crises struck on both sides of the Atlantic, neoliberal ideas began to enter the mainstream. They were fringy and weird and crazy before. As Milton Friedman remarked, when the time came that you had to change, there was an alternative ready there to be picked up, talking about the neoliberal economic policies that he favored so much and that he helped foment with his Chicago boys. With the help of sympathetic journalists and political advisors, elements of neoliberalism, especially its prescriptions for monetary policy, were adopted by an administration that was headed by a former president we all know and generally love today. And despite what you might think, that president was not Bill Clinton. But first, let's revisit the end of the Nixon administration, because that's actually important to where we're going. So remember that Nixon was the president who wanted to make Chile's economy scream, right? Remember that? Under Milton Friedman's neoliberal policies, which has transplanted the Chicago boys into Chile and in the government and in economic positions of authority, and they crafted this economic policy they call the BRIC. But when Friedman wanted to implement those same kinds of policies in the United States, Nixon actually balked because he knew that the American people would run him out of office if he implemented the same kinds of policies. Remember, in the last episode, in 1971, the U.S. economy was in a slump. Unemployment was high and inflation was pushing prices way up. Nixon knew that if he followed Friedman's laissez-faire advice, millions of angry citizens would vote him out of a job. Remember what Margaret Thatcher said about not being able to implement Friedman-like policies in the UK because her government just wasn't set up like that. So Nixon decided to put caps on the prices of necessities like rent and oil. And Friedman was outraged. Remember, of all possible government distortions, price controls were the absolute worst. Friedman called them a cancer that can destroy an economic system's capacity to function. Friedman was so angry that he felt betrayed by Nixon. And he hated him so much that he called Richard Nixon the most socialist president in the history of U.S. presidents. So let's take a few minutes to look at what the Nixon presidency was facing to understand why any of that and why anything I'm going to tell you after that matters. Now, the Nixon administration marked the end of America's long period of post-World War II prosperity and the onset of a period of high unemployment and high inflation, or was called stagflation of all things. And I have to be honest with you, I hadn't heard of this word until I started doing research for this series. So I'm learning right along with you. Unemployment was unusually low when Nixon took office in January 1969. It was at 3.3%, but inflation was already rising. So what in the world is stagflation? Stagflation was an economic phenomenon of the 70s resulting from a combination of economic stagnation, rising prices, and inflation. The post-World War II boom years of the 50s and the 60s, in which the U.S. dominated international trade, ended as European competition increased, oil prices rose, imports exceeded exports, spending decreased, and unemployment increased. The gross domestic product, or GDP, of the United States fell as the economic performance of the nation declined, resulting in a lower standard of living across the whole country. So, stagflation was an enormous departure from this very long period of time after World War II that the United States experienced this wonderful growth in its economy. So then you have to ask the question, so why was there so much prosperity after World War II? Well, the post-World War II economic expansion, which is also known as the post-war economic boom, was also called the golden age of capitalism. And it was a period of economic prosperity in the mid-20th century and lasted until the early 70s, but it was marked by $200 billion with a B in war bonds that matured, the GI Bill that financed a well-educated workforce, and then the middle class swelled, as did GDP and productivity. And New Deal policies helped increase that GDP and productivity. So historians will tell you that growth was distributed fairly evenly across economic classes, but we all know from history that that's not true, because the growth certainly wasn't equal among racial classes. But what was true was that even the black middle class grew. It just grew less than the white middle class did. Now, a lot of people attribute this growth in American society and the expansion of the American economy to the strength of labor unions in this period. And labor union membership peaked during the 1950s. So much of the growth came from the movement of low-income farm workers who moved from the South and the Midwest and into cities, into better paying jobs, factory jobs. And that process, though, was largely completed, pretty much ended around 1960. And at that time, what happened? Well, the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system in 1971. Then came the 1973 oil crisis. Then came the 1973-1974 stock market crash. And then the spending and the social fallout of the Vietnam War, all of which contributed to the recession in the 70s. So by the time Richard Nixon was reelected in 1972, unemployment had reached 6.2%, while inflation raged unchecked despite his price controls, which many argue actually made the economic crisis worse. By 1973, expansive fiscal and monetary policies combined with believe it or not, a shortage of food, which was aggravated by massive Soviet purchases of American wheat. So if you ever watch The Americans, did you see the episode about the potential tampering with wheat that America was selling to Russia? That the spies thought was being infected by insects? That not completely off base. Then came the oil shock. Oil prices were rising even before the onset of the Arab oil boycott in October of 1973. Some of you are probably too young to remember this, but I actually remember long lines at the gas pumps. Ultimately, inflation would climb to 12.1% in 1974 and help push the economy into a recession, so that when Nixon left office, the economy was completely in the tank, with rising unemployment, inflation, long gas lines that I told you about, and a crashing stock market. So, of course, Nixon resigned from the presidency in 1973 due to the Watergate scandal, which was another contributor to the social downward mood of the nation. And his vice president, Gerald Ford, assumed the presidency and passed the first major deregulatory legislation in modern politics with the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976. It didn't do a lot, but what it did was set the stage for the next elected president. And it heralded the moment that the Democratic Party really did take a rightward turn. And it's a point in the history of American politics that either a lot of liberals either don't know about or don't want to admit. Because it wasn't Ronald Reagan that heralded the onset of neoliberal policies in American government. No, it was President Jimmy Carter. President Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976, and he did inherit an awful economic mess. He absolutely did. That was not at all of his own doing when he got into office. So the train wreck of a presidency that conservatives like to lay at Carter's feet, really, if we want to be truthful and honest, it wasn't entirely his fault. But let's also be honest about something else. What President Carter did in response to the nightmare of an economy that he inherited, how he tried to fix it, was entirely his responsibility. And he wasn't vague about knowing what he was doing. When the energy crisis set in, Carter was planning on delivering his fifth major speech on energy. Fifth! That's how bad the energy crisis was in the United States. However, at this point, he felt like the American people weren't even listening to him. He had given so many speeches on the energy. Everybody knew what the problems were. His pollster, Pat Cadell, told him that the American people simply faced a crisis of confidence because of the 1960s and the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and other civil rights leaders, the entire tumultuous period of time where the civil rights movement existed, the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, all of this contributed to what people characterized later as Carter saying was the national malaise, although he never actually used that word in his address to the nation. So on July 15th, 1979, midway in his term, 2 years into his term, Carter gave a nationally televised address in which he identified what he believed to be a crisis of confidence among the American people. Like I said, this became known as his malaise speech. Never used the word in the speech. What he did say was this, quote, "I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. I do not refer to the outward strength of America, a nation that is at peace tonight everywhere in the world." The Vietnam War was over. "With unmatched economic power and military might, the threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation."
In a nation that was proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. 2/3 of our people do not even vote. The productivity of American workers is actually dropping. And the willingness of Americans to save for the future has fallen below that of all other people in the Western world. As you know, there is a growing disrespect for government and for churches and for schools, the news media, and other institutions. This is not a message of happiness or reassurance, but it is the truth, and it is a warning. These changes did not happen overnight. They've come upon us gradually over the last generation. Years that were filled with shocks and tragedy.
Do you notice how President Carter talks about the tenets of what we come to think of today as conservative thought? Hard work, strong families, faith in God. That's not really conservative thought, but we usually hear that from conservatives. True, he was a Christian himself, but he is absolutely trying to appeal to conservative Americans with that kind of language, because that's actually how he campaigned. He also talked about the productivity of American workers dropping, but he contributed to that with his deregulation policies. He talked about the willingness of Americans to save for the future and how that's falling. But American workers were making less money. Inflation was high, unemployment was high, fuel prices was high. Americans just had less to save. He talks about the growing disrespect for government and churches and for schools. Understand the content, the context, the historical context of when he's saying what he is saying. This is in the aftermath of the assassinations of the Kennedys, MLK and other civil rights leaders, the entire civil rights movement, the Vietnam War and protests against it, the feminist equal rights movement, Watergate. People were waking up to the idea that they could and should ask questions of their government, demanding to know why it wasn't doing what it should do by its people. But in this speech, Carter is trying to lift the spirits of the American people by appealing to their patriotism and solid family values, but also reminding Americans that you need to obey and respect the authority of the government. It's a typical conservative-leaning appeal to middle Americans who didn't like, didn't understand, and didn't much care for the social upheaval going on at the time. I know that's an unpopular thing to say about Jimmy Carter, but just because it's unpopular doesn't mean it's not true. So President Carter makes this speech, and as his pollster Pat Caddell said, he told the truth about the situation that Carter was facing in his presidency. Pat Caddell says, "This crisis is not your fault as president. It is the natural result of historical forces and events that have been in motion for 20 years. This crisis threatens the political and social fabric of our nation. Yet," listen to this. This is very, very interesting. "Yet, this crisis also represents the greatest opportunity for you as president to become a great president on the order of Lincoln, Wilson, and Franklin Roosevelt." Where else have we heard a politician saying that we should look at a disaster as an opportunity? She wasn't the first person to say it. It's an idea that is as old as neoliberal policies are. More interestingly, Caddell goes on to say, it presents you with the opportunity so rare in American history to reshape the structure, nature, and purpose of the United States in fundamental ways which your predecessors could only dream. So in his fifth speech about the energy crisis and America's path forward out of it, Carter didn't really talk a lot about energy because he talked about that in 4 previous speeches, but he appealed to certain values in a certain section of America. And it worked for a very short period of time because the economic crisis didn't let up. An interesting side note, in an effort to break America's reliance on foreign oil, which was a major impact on the economic woes of the country because of the oil boycott of the Arab nations, Carter even gave a nod to the populist drill here, drill now contingent in the United States government who felt the country had enough resources already to be energy dependent. As a matter of fact, President Carter himself said, quote, "We will protect our environment, but when this nation critically needs a refinery or a pipeline, we will build it. We have more oil in our shale alone than several Saudi Arabias. We have more coal than any nation on earth." Please keep in mind that even at this period of time, the CEO of ExxonMobil, who wasn't Rex Tillerson at the time, but the CEO of ExxonMobil knew the effects of fracking and fossil fuel consumption that was not reduced back in the 70s. And instead of acting on that information, the CEO of ExxonMobil buried that information. It was recently unearthed by some college students. Think about the juxtaposition of that information and an energy crisis, an oil crisis that was going on at the time. I'll let you draw some conclusions on your own with that. So, what is it that Jimmy Carter did that earns him the brand of neoliberal, or the first Democratic president to usher in neoliberal policies? Well, he pushed a lot of deregulation. He devoted substantial effort to transportation deregulation and worked with congressional and civil society leaders to pass the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, and the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. All had a tremendous impact on the industrialized backbone of the United States. Because these three pieces of legislation are what really began the systematic industrialization of the U.S. Innumerable blue-collar jobs were significantly diminished. That was a national asset carried over from the New Deal. Carter, who originally claimed to regard unemployment as one of the most crucial issues, reversed his policy, deciding instead that addressing inflation was of paramount importance. And that, of course, made the trade unionists of the AFL-CIO angry, who were up until this point an integral part of the Democratic electoral base. They believed that Carter would propose a public works program of $30 billion to reduce unemployment. Why would they think that? Well, because it had been done before under FDR, and it worked. So why not do it again? But Carter's refusal to enact the program produced resentment among industrial trade unionists. And at this point, labor was in open rebellion against Carter. The AFL-CIO termed Carter's new plan as a retreat from the goals we understand President-elect Carter to have set during last year's election campaign. And similarly, Democratic mayors in cities who needed an infusion of aid were shunned by the Carter administration. And these were the groups who elected him in the first place. So what impact did these bills have on American labor specifically? Let's look at the Airline Deregulation Act. In the 60s and the 70s, the Civil Aeronautics Board set strict regulations for the airline industry. It managed routes and it set fares, and it guaranteed a 12% profit for any flight that was at least 50% full. So it wasn't like the existing airlines weren't making money. The government guaranteed that they would. But the airlines believed that in order to make a lot of money, they had to set the prices very high. And as a result, airline travel was so expensive that 80% of Americans had never flown. It also took a long time for the board to approve new routes or any other changes. So along comes Carter's Airline Deregulation Act, and it solved those problems. Safety was the only part of the industry that remained regulated. Competition rose, fares dropped, and more people took to the skies. And as a matter of fact, under Jimmy Carter's Airline Regulation Act, he specifically stated that he was implementing the legislation to keep monopolies from happening. But you know what happened. As fares dropped, so did the wages of many employees. As the larger carriers needed to cut costs to remain competitive with the new carriers who were coming into the market with non-union, lower-paid workers. And eventually, over time, many companies that could no longer compete were merged and acquired or went bankrupt. And as a result, just 4 airlines remained: American, Delta, United, and Southwest. They controlled 85% of the U.S. market, creating the near monopoly that President Carter said he implemented the legislation to avoid. So, first, small and even mid-sized cities such as Pittsburgh and Cincinnati were underserved because of all of the smaller airlines that went out of business or were consolidated or merged with the bigger ones. It just wasn't cost effective for the major airlines to keep up a full schedule. So smaller carriers served those cities, if they survived, at a higher cost to the consumer and less frequently. And second, airlines began charging customers for things that used to be free. Things that we are used to paying today, but we hate, and we don't know where these fees came from. Fees like ticket changes, meals. Do you remember when meals on airline flights used to be free? Luggage. And third, we see now that flying itself has become such a miserable experience, with cramped seating as airlines try to cram more people into a plane to make more money off of more fees, because it's the fees they make money off of, not the actual ticket. Cramped seating, crowded flights, long waits, and now just flat out abuse. This is the long-term result of Jimmy Carter's Airline Deregulation Act. He also passed the Freight Rail Deregulation Act, called the Staggers Rail Act. Railroads used to combine freight rail and passenger rail, but the passenger rail service wasn't as profitable as the freight rail service for a lot of rail carriers. So after the passage of the Staggers Rail Act, the railroads immediately divested themselves of their unprofitable passenger business and began to concentrate on the freight activity, the business that was the most profitable and least subject to competition from other modes of bulk freight. And now, having separated themselves from passenger rail, the railroads were still stuck with the high fixed costs of track upkeep. All these tracks that they're not using anymore because they don't have passenger rail service anymore. So they abandoned tracks. Over 100,000 miles of tracks were abandoned. Operators increasingly focused on strategic long-distance corridors, linking major gateways and inland markets. And of course, operating costs were reduced, but the operating costs were reduced also at the expense of employees. Just like with the airline industry, as small airlines went out of business, those employees lost their jobs. Contracts with the unions produced agreement to remove brakemen from the trains, thereby doing away with 1/3 of the personnel required for train operation, removing the need for cabooses. That's the result of the Staggers Rail Act, deregulation of the rail industry. How about the Motor Carrier Act of 1980? This is a personal thing for me because my husband is a truck driver. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 deregulated the trucking industry. Talk to any trucker of any age between 40 and 50 years old today, and they will all tell you that the trucking industry is nothing like it used to be back in the day. Because truck drivers used to be able to make a decent living driving trucks. But after the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, not so much. Because the trucking industry went through the most severe shakeout since the Great Depression, especially in the last 3-4 years. More than 72 freight haulers. In the past 10 years, more than 72 freight haulers that were in business in 1978 had shut down after the passage of the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, taking more than $2.2 billion or 16% of the industry's revenues with them and all of those jobs. These weren't upstarts. They included former industry giants like Cooper Jarrett, Ezor Express, Gordon Transport. Of course you don't hear about these companies anymore. They went out of business. Another group of companies accounting for $3.9 billion, or about 28% of the industry's revenues, had such poor operating ratios from 1980 to 1982 that they could be considered candidates for failure. I believe these figures came from around 1985. I apologize. I had my figures all messed up in my head. So while many established carriers closed down after the passage of the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, thousands of new, non-union, low-cost truckers have come into the business. As the Interstate Commerce Commission, as ordered by Congress, dropped its entry barriers to try to increase competition. What was one of the barriers for entry? Most of the truckers in large companies had to be union employees. The impact on union labor was dramatic. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, I know they were run by a bunch of gangsters, but the union membership weren't gangsters. They were working men and women. In its own check of 36 locals, found that the percentage of drivers on long-term layoff reached 32.2% of its membership in April of 1981, up from 22%. Those locals represented about 1/3 of the 300,000 workers which were employed under the Master Freight Agreement that covers the trucking industry. The industry concluded that from 85,000 to 107,000 of its members were laid off as of April 1982. And the trucking industry has never recovered. It is very, very difficult to get a decent paying local trucking job, regional trucking job, or a long distance trucking job. So in every instance of deregulation in any industry, airline, motor freight, trucking, or railroad, the push for fewer government regulations to allow for greater competition in the market always drove small carriers out of business, pushed people into employment, drove wages down for the workers who remained. Interestingly enough, though, what isn't talked about are all the new regulations that are put into place to govern who's allowed to compete and who isn't. So usually the regulation balance is actually kind of evened out. The only difference is that the regulations that are implemented now favor the industry and their ability to make unlimited profits over those workers and ensuring that they are paid fairly out of those profits they help create with their labor. These are from Jimmy Carter's policies. And I know it's shocking, but you shouldn't be shocked by Carter's policies and how they negatively affected American workers. Not if you know that Alfred Kahn was a key advisor to Carter. And Kahn was the architect of Carter's airline deregulation policy, which led to the deregulation of trucking, telecoms, power industries, and heralded the Thatcherite and Reaganite revolutions. Thomas Frank, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later, actually notes in his book, Listen Liberal, one of the most shocking quotes in the book is from Alfred Kahn, an advisor to Jimmy Carter, who said, quote, "I'd love the Teamsters to be worse off. I'd love the automobile workers to be worse off." He then basically says that unionized workers are exploiting other workers. More than any other event, the process of deindustrialization and its parallel, the defeat of labor, accelerated when Carter nominated Paul Volcker as the head of the Federal Reserve. I'm going to try to go through this very quickly because it's all economic stuff, but it's very, very interesting. Volcker's paradoxical remedy for purging the economic system of inflation, because remember, inflation's still going on. Volcker proceeded to gut the U.S. industrial base with astronomical interest rate increases. Excuse me. He raised the prime interest rate as high as 22%, constricting productive activity. The Federal Reserve's attempts to fight stagflation only ended up making it worse, because between 1971 and 1978, excuse me, the Fed under Volcker raised the interest rates, then lowered it, and this stop-and-go monetary policy confused businesses. They kept prices high, businesses did, even when the Feds lowered the rates. That only sent inflation up to 13.3% by 1979. Excuse me. Carter then enacted an austerity program by executive order, justifying what Volcker did, which again hampered what was left of the industrial base in the United States from doing business because of the astronomical interest rates that they couldn't afford. Carter justified these measures by observing that the inflation had reached a crisis stage because both inflation and short-term interest rates were at 18% in February and March in 1980. And of course, this policy led to a sharp recession in 1980. The GDP fell, lower interest rates eventually eased the recession and the easing of credit controls. But the auto industry that relied on favorable interest rates to do business, and the housing sectors never completely recovered. GDP and employment totals regained pre-recession levels by the first quarter of 1981, but the damage was done. The Carter administration remained fiscally conservative during both growth and recession periods, his entire administration, vetoing numerous spending increases while enacting deregulation in the energy and transportation sectors and sharply reducing the top capital gains tax rate. You see, it's not just the Republicans who want to give the wealthy a break. Of course, Paul Volcker raising the interest rates to 22% basically created the 1980-82 recession. But this was the kind of economic shock that Friedman and his neoliberal acolytes, who weren't just Republicans, felt were the prime canvas on which to paint their market-focused, socially starving policies. Carter obliged, true to neoliberal form, because in 1977, in a Washington Post article, the Democrats blasted Carter because of his fiscal scrooginess. They talked about his not sending Congress a detailed welfare reform proposal until August, that his plan wouldn't take full effect until 1981, and that initially, at least, it would involve no increase in federal expenditures. Carter campaigned on the promise of implementing a national health insurance single payer, but he kicked that down the can. Didn't address it at all. Carter's determination to have a balanced budget in 1981 is one of the reasons he gave for ignoring the national health insurance policy issue. Carter said in his campaign that he would cut defense spending by $5 billion, which would free more money for domestic issues. That pledge, too, lost some clarity on Election Day. Excuse me. Carter's resistance to cut the defense budget helped throw the entire budget resolution off track. Democrats were angry that Carter promised tax reform time and time again in the campaign, and reform proposals were sent to Congress. But in the meantime, while he was promising tax reform, he proposed an important cut for low-income taxpayers, which was a good thing, that was good, as part of his tax bill to stimulate the economy. But at the same time, He also proposed a tax cut for independent oil producers, which was part of the same bill, and which actually would have undone one section of the Tax Reform Act Congress passed in 1976. Carter even stopped talking about tax reform at all. He just started talking about tax incentives to encourage increased business investment and expansion. And Carter's Democratic supporters and his conservative detractors did miss what he was saying. Today's Democrats would really like to forget that supply-side economics was embraced by many members of their own party during the Carter years. He wasn't the only one. There were people around him advising him who were pushing these policies, and he was agreeing to them. While it was resisted by many old-fashioned fiscal conservatives in the GOP. As the economist Bruce Bartlett points out in A History of Supply-Side Economics, he says, by 1980, the Joint Economic Committee of Congress was a full-blown advocate of supply-side economics, despite having a majority of liberal Democrats, such as Senators Edward Kennedy and George McGovern, on the membership. Its annual report that year, in 1980, was entitled Plugging in the Supply Side. Now, it is very true that at the end of his administration, President Jimmy Carter had seen a substantial decrease in unemployment and a partial reduction of the deficit, but the recession ultimately actually continued. And he did some good things. I'm not saying that President Carter was an awful, evil president, because he created the U.S. Department of Education. He created the U.S. Department of Energy. He established a national energy policy and pursued civil service and social security reform. And in foreign affairs, he was much braver than people give him credit for, because he strongly emphasized human rights throughout his career. He signed the second round of the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, the SALT II talks with the Soviet Union. And in an effort to end the Arab-Israeli conflict, he initiated the Camp David Accords. With the Torrijos-Carter treaties, he guaranteed the transfer of the Panama Canal back to Panama in 1999, and the conservatives really didn't like that. His administration also established official diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, while he signed the Taiwan Relations Act to define relations with Taiwan. He did some good things, as every president does. But let's not forget that it was President Carter, not President Reagan, who presided over the beginning of the dismantling of the New Deal regulatory system in airlines, railroads, and trucking, crippling the industrial sector, beginning the hamstringing of the industrial sector in this country. He did it with the intention to reduce inflation by reducing the cost of essential infrastructure to business. But Carter's market-focused reforms backfired. But can we really say they backfired? Because now conservatives look at Carter's record and say, oh, his regulatory or deregulatory reforms were successful because look at all of the growth, look at all of the money the airline industry has made, trucking industry is still making, and the freight rail industry is still making. What they never talk about when they talk about the growth of industry is the other end of the pendulum. Because all of the growth is being implemented off of the labor, the lowly paid, inadequately compensated labor of employees. Carter's deregulations also produced constant bankruptcies, predatory hub and spoke monopolies, and oligopolistic, need to look that word up, private railroad industry that's completely abandoned passenger rail. And now we have Amtrak that the federal government is trying to get rid of, and underpaid, overworked truckers. Just in case you were wondering, Carter and Reagan were similar in ideology in other ways too that are very disturbing. In politics, both Carter and Reagan sought to exploit the white backlash in the aftermath of the civil rights revolution that led to many white Southerners and white Northern ethnics to defect from the Democrats to support third-party populist candidate George Wallace. Reagan did it overtly, so we thought, by beginning his general election campaign in 1980 in Neshoba County, Mississippi. Some people call that place Philadelphia, Mississippi. It ought to be familiar to you, because it's where white supremacists had recently firebombed the black church and had earlier murdered 3 Northern civil rights activists, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. In a thinly disguised appeal to white Southern racism, Reagan declared, quote, "I believe in states' rights," end quote. And trust me, I will get into why the states' rights movement is very problematic to the history of race relations in this country. But that's another series. So why is Jimmy Carter similar to Ronald Reagan in this respect? Well, Jimmy Carter used similar coded language in fishing for votes from white ethnics in the North who objected to blacks moving into their neighborhoods, because another phenomenon that was going on at this time was integration. In an interview with the New York Daily News in April 1976, Carter said, quote, "I see nothing wrong with ethnic purity being maintained. I would not force a racial integration of a neighborhood by government action," end quote. A few days later, questioned about his remark, Carter elaborated, quote, "What I say is that the government ought not to take as a major purpose the intrusion of alien groups," that's what he actually said, "into a neighborhood simply to establish their intrusion," end quote. Jesse Jackson called this a throwback to Hitlerian racism. But Carter not only won a majority of the Southern vote, but he also did well among white Northerners. Just to be clear, integration has nothing to do with the government participating in the intrusion of alien groups into a neighborhood or anywhere else simply to establish their intrusion. Integration has everything to do with equal access, fairness, equality, and dismantling opposition to opportunity. But let me go on. Ronald Reagan was certainly guilty for the policies and the actions and the outcomes that were undoubtedly his. He was. But Carter was just as much of a neoliberal with a preference for the market as Reagan was. And those racial dog whistle viewpoints and words and statements, they actually matter in the history of the Democratic Party at this point. But as far as neoliberalism is concerned, the beginning of the rightward turn of the Democratic Party toward neoliberalism, history proves that it was Carter who got the ball rolling. History also proves that the Democratic Party never returned to its post-Jim Crow roots as a populist, advocates for the working class poor, and marginalized party. The Democratic Leadership Council was established in the wake of President Ronald Reagan's 1984 landslide victory, in which he won 49 states over Democrat Walter Mondale. Pondering the Mondale defeat, a gathering of Southern Democrats and Northern neoliberals expressed concerns that the Democratic Party faced extinction, particularly in the South and the West, if the party continued to rely on its New Deal message of government and kept catering to traditional constituencies of labor, minorities, and anti-war progressives. In 1985, Al Fromm, then an aide to Representative Gillis Long, who was a Democrat from Louisiana, took the lead in formulating a new messaging strategy for the party's centrists, neoliberals, and conservatives. In his Saving the Democratic Party memo of January 1985, Fromm advocated the formation of a governing council that would draft a blueprint for reforming the party. Remember, moving away from the traditional base. According to Fromm, the new leadership should aim to create distance from the new bosses, which were organized labor, feminists, other progressive constituency groups. He believed that these constituency groups were keeping the party from modernizing. Fromm's memo sparked the formation of the Democratic Leadership Council in 1985. According to a book by Balls and Brownstein, within a few weeks, the Democratic Leadership Council counted 75 members, primarily governors and members of Congress, most of them from the Sun Belt, and almost all of them white. Liberal critics instantly dubbed the group the White Male Caucus. So were you upset that Donald Trump's health care panel didn't include any women? Seems that he wasn't the first one who decided to convene a group of policymakers and exclude an enormous part of the population, his constituency, women, minorities. The Democrats did it too. Although DLC members shared, for the most part, neoliberal perspectives of centrist Democrats like Gary Hart, Paul Tsongas, Michael Dukakis, wasn't he a mess? They took a much harsher conservative stance on social issues and foreign policy issues. DLC Democrats supported aid to the Contras, for example, which is part of the reason so few Democrats really spoke out against the Iran-Contra CIA drug connection scandal. They applauded Ronald Reagan's evil empire rhetoric, and they offered their support to those militarists calling for missile defense and rejected arms control negotiations. These were all Democrats. In a 1986 conference on the legacy of the Johnson administration's Great Society initiatives, DLC chairman Charles Chuck Robb, governor of Virginia, do you remember him? I do, took up the neoconservative critique of liberalism, first articulated in the 1970s by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and other neoconservatives. According to Robb, and I actually remember watching him say this on C-SPAN, I think, Chuck Robb said, quote, "While racial discrimination has by no means vanished from our society, it's time to shift the primary focus from racism, the traditional enemy without, to self-defeating patterns of behavior, the enemy within." This is from a Democratic governor. So you see, from its inception, the DLC was at loggerheads with progressive Democrats and other liberal leftist leaders. One of the most outspoken critics, I don't care how you feel about him, but he was outspoken against the DLC, was Jesse Jackson, who once said that the DLC actually stands for Democrats for the Leadership Class. Because you see, the DLC's goal was to advance, quote, a message that was less tilted toward minorities and welfare, less radical on social issues like abortion and gays, more pro-defense and more conservative on economic issues, wrote Robert Dreyfuss in a 2001 article in the American Prospect. He said the DLC thundered against the liberal fundamentalism of the party's base, which was unions, blacks, feminists, Greens, and cause groups generally. Within the DLC, populism was not only out of favor, it was militantly opposed. The organization had virtually no grassroots supporters. This is extremely important. It was funded almost entirely by corporate donors. She learned it from somewhere. The DLC is where. Its executive council was made up of companies that donated at least $25,000, a lot of money at that time, and included Enron and Koch Industries. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Koch Industries at one time contributed money to the Democratic leadership organization. A list of its known donors included scores of the United States' most powerful corporations, all of whom benefit from a Democratic Party that embraces what? Big business, and is less reliant on labor unions, and the grassroots for support. The organization's influence was significant, especially in the 1990s. The New York Times reported that during that era, the Democratic Leadership Council was a maker of presidents. Its influence continued into the post-Clinton years. Actually, Al Gore, Joe Lieberman, John Kerry, John Edwards, Dick Gephardt, and countless others all lent their names in support of the organization. The DLC and its think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute, were well financed and published an endless barrage of policy papers, op-eds, declarations. And the people we are probably most associated with, most easily associated with the DLC are these two guys, Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. When Al Gore, a DLC member since its first years, he was one of the founding members, chose DLC chairman Joseph Lieberman to be his presidential running mate, the DLC staff felt triumphant. Al Fromm predicted that soon we'll be able to proclaim that all Democrats are indeed new Democrats. They wanted a whole new Democratic Party. However, many high-profile Democrats, including former presidential candidate Howard Dean, publicly disavowed the organization. Dean actually once criticized the DLC's new Democratic agenda as the Republican wing of the Democratic Party. Isn't it interesting to see how Howard Dean and his ilk have come full circle in supporting the establishment, anti-populist, anti-progressive, third-way Democratic Party establishment that he once so passionately railed against? Isn't that interesting? The height of the DLC's triumph may well have been in the 1990s when it claimed President Bill Clinton as its most prominent advocate, celebrating his disastrous welfare cuts, which were supported by Hillary Clinton as First Lady. I don't care how many people deny it, she did support them. His support for the North American Free Trade Agreement, and his speech declaring that the era of big government is over. Again, speaking to conservative-leaning Americans who had a hatred of big government because of who? Ronald Reagan. And Jimmy Carter. The initiatives of Bill Clinton had the DLC's footprint all over them. But it wasn't just here in the United States that the DLC's prescribed third-way policies found a home, because in the UK, again, third-way policies found a home on Downing Street in England. Tony Blair was a major Clinton ally. He was a staunch advocate of the DLC and adopted its strategies. He even lent his name to its website. According to the book Clinton and Blair, The Political Economy of the Third Way, he said in 1998 that it is a third way because it moves decisively beyond an old left preoccupied by state control, high taxation, and producer interests. So Ronnie and Maggie weren't the only US, UK, British political soulmates after all. So, okay, I know you are wondering, because I keep introducing these terms that you don't know, you probably don't know, aren't familiar with. So what is third way? In the United States, third way adherents embrace fiscal conservatism to a greater extent than traditional economic liberals and advocate some replacement of welfare with workfare, and sometimes have a stronger preference for market solutions to traditional problems, while rejecting pure laissez-faire economics and other libertarian positions. The interesting thing about third way politicians of the Democratic ilk is that third way Democrats seek to undermine the opposition by borrowing policies from the opposition in an effort to seize this middle to achieve political dominance. Examples of this are Nixon's economic policies, which were a continuation of Johnson's Great Society, and obviously later Clinton's welfare reform. But listen to what this is saying about the Democrats, third way Democrats. They want to borrow policies from the opposition, the conservatives, the Republicans, the people who they keep telling us don't really care about us, in an effort to undermine them. But they don't really undermine them. They have no intention of undermining them. They just want to get the votes of their base so they can achieve political dominance. So when we say that third way Democrats are just as bad as conservative Republicans on some issues, from economic to social, we're not throwing shade at them. This is their plan. And each Democratic president we've had since Carter has been an inheritor and an ambassador of the DLC's model and legacy of the dismissal of critical racial, social justice, and labor issues that are important to enormous swaths of the American populace. But that they'll argue that's how they win elections, by ignoring those issues that you and I care about. This is a very interesting take on the legacy of the DLC. Take a listen.
The Democratic Party has a problem in that they are increasingly not the party of whites. Now it's true that whites remain a shrinking part of the electorate, but they're still the lion's share of voters. So what do Democrats do? And again, it's a difficult dance for Democratic politicians, not just Obama. They've had to somehow manage to fashion a set of policies that simultaneously appeal to blacks and browns and Asian Americans as well, even as they try to hold on to white voters. And we saw a lot of this play out in the aftermath of the failed election of, say, Walter Mondale in 1984 or Michael Dukakis in '88. Democrats were really kind of in turmoil at the leadership level about what they should do. The Democratic Leadership Conference emerged from that process, this effort to try to rebrand the Democratic Party so that it wasn't the party of minorities. And indeed, Bill Clinton grew out of that movement. He led that movement at one point, and of course ultimately was elected to the White House. Obama is not officially and has not been officially linked with the DLC, but he has kind of unofficially been linked with the DLC, and the DLC has seen him as one of their own, the Democratic Leadership Conference, this movement to try to moderate the ideological image of the Democratic Party. So what the Democrats have done to try to address this effort to paper over the differences between the policy preferences of their minority constituents and the policy preferences of their white constituents is to mostly try not to talk about those issues on which they're divided. I mean, this is something that political parties as a rule, try to do. Let's talk about those things we agree about and not so much about those things we don't agree about.
So you see, this focus on the shift from the policies that are important in regards to not just labor, not just women's issues, not just other groups of marginalized people, but race also, that's occurred in the Democratic Party is intentional. It really is what they're willing to give up, what they're willing to ignore in order to win. And please understand, they don't ever intend to address those issues when they win, as we have so well seen. But don't believe me. Believe Thomas Frank, who has actually made a name for himself with his critiques of Republican politics until he wrote an amazing book called Listen Liberal. I encourage you to read this book. Thomas Frank, interestingly enough, is a liberal Democrat. At least that's how he identifies himself. So he wrote this great book, Listen Liberal, and he talks about the history in much more detail than what I just talked to you about of when the Democratic Party made this shift away from black people and the policies that are important to blacks, and labor and the policies that are important to labor, the policies that are important to working class and poor Americans and women. He talks about when all of this happened and how much it's damaged not just the Democratic brand, but the American people. Thomas Frank makes the case that liberalism itself has changed. And what's really happening now is that the Democrats aren't who we think they are. That's the answer, he says, basically, to every question you want to raise about the Democrats for the past 30 or so years. And I skimmed over a lot of stuff because I've only got an hour and a half. But I hope I've made it very clear that the Democrats really aren't who they say they are. Because according to Thomas Frank, the Democrats' official motto is that they're the party of the people, but really they're a class party now. I mean, the Republicans are as well, but the Democrats are definitely a class party, not in the way you and I might think of class. But they don't think of working people and poor people as important enough for them to focus on. We're not going to win them any elections. We don't have that much clout for them. They focus now on the professional class, the people with advanced degrees. They use that phrase themselves all the time, the professional class. And Thomas Frank says the first piece of evidence at what's happening is the financial crisis and what's happened since then. Inequality's actually gotten worse under Democratic presidents. And we were assured that Democratic presidents were the most, this one particular Democratic president, President Obama, was the most liberal or radical president we would ever see. That's what we were told. But inequality's gotten worse. And the gains since the financial crisis, since the recovery began, went to who? Not you and me. It went to the top 10%. Actually, the percentage is now smaller than that. So this isn't just because of the evil Republicans. It's not just because of the obstruction that Obama received. Because really, let's be honest, because we're all about being honest here on Brick by Brick, Obama played it the way he wanted to, just like a DLC Democrat would, just like a third way Democrat would, just like a neoliberal Democrat would. He had a majority in both houses of Congress for 2 years, and he could have done anything he wanted. But he consistently made policies that favored the top, less than 10%, over everybody else. And it's very difficult for Democrats to admit that's true. He helped out Wall Street in an enormous way when they were completely at his mercy. He could have done anything. But he didn't. He bailed out Wall Street, and he left Main Street behind. So we focused on money in politics, and it's a huge part of the story, but the class war in the Democratic Party goes deeper than that. Because Democrats have basically made their commitment to white-collar educated professionals and to moneyed interests and to corporate interests. And it's worked out well for them because of the money in politics. So when they choose the top less than 10% of the income distribution as their most important constituents, that's the story of money. And it wasn't obvious in the 70s under Carter. It wasn't obvious when they made that choice, but over the years we have the benefit of hindsight now to look back on that history and say, wait, we're giving Reagan too much credit. He wasn't that smart. He wasn't that devious. He was, but he wasn't that devious to have caused all of this chaos against the working class and the poor all on his own. No, there was a pretty good foundation laid for him by President Carter. Over the years, for the Democrats, it became clear that the smart choice in terms of their ability to raise money was to focus on the wealthy, the corporate interests. Organized labor, it's not like they can't raise money. They have a lot of clout in terms of the ability to raise money in dollar, but again, we're just not that powerful. Our money isn't even that valuable to them. So it doesn't matter how much money we contribute to the Democratic Party. We will never get our way with them if we continue to vote for neoliberal Democrats. I want you to watch this last video clip. Well, that's not true. It's not the last video clip. I am going to leave you with one of my favorite video clips for the rest of the evening to end this show. But I want you to watch this video clip. It's an exchange between Bill Maher and Thomas Frank. And the conversation is exactly representative of one of the reasons we have a hard time not voting for neoliberal Democrats today.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Shit on the liberals. Go ahead. See how you like it.
All right. So what the book is about is basically that the Democrats aren't who we think they are. You think they're the party of the people, the party of the workers, the party of labor? They aren't.
Yeah.
So who are they? Who are they?
Well, you talk about the liberalism of the rich, which is an interesting concept.
It's a party of the white-collar professional class. Affluent white-collar professionals.
Kale eaters.
Kale eaters. That's good.
And that's a great shorthand.
But you wonder about why...
My parents didn't eat kale.
You wonder about...
It didn't even exist. And they were dyed-in-the-wool.
We had it in Kansas.
Well, really? Back then?
Yeah.
Well, we didn't have it in New Jersey. And, like...
I don't think you have it there yet now. I don't think it's in New Jersey. Oh, you do? Okay, you have it.
But they were real Democrats, but they were a very different breed than these kind of Democrats.
Absolutely. And but today's breed, it's these Ivy League guys doing favors for other Ivy League guys. Look at the Obama administration, the revolving door with Wall Street. Look at the Clinton administration, same kind of thing. And if it's not Wall Street, it's Silicon Valley, it's Big Pharma. So yeah, it's a liberalism of the rich. This is a liberalism of the winners, of the new economy winners. The people who are left behind, of course, organized labor,
and this is why these white working class people have abandoned the Democratic Party for a long time, going back to Reagan Democrats. I think I read that 50,000 Democrats switched over to vote for Trump in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's been going on for a long time, since the early 70s.
Right.
We have someone here who could tell us all about it in the earliest days.
Why?
Classic TV.
I played a liberal on television.
No, but you remember this. I mean, this is of course. No, this has been going on. This has been going on for a very long time, and it was actually done in a kind of deliberate way back in the McGovern days, in the early 1970s during the Vietnam War. That organized labor was kind of removed from its structural position within the Democratic Party. and then it's gathered strength and gathered speed ever since then. Today it's basically.
I feel liberals just got lazy. I feel the bar to be smarter than a Republican is so low, and it's so easy to do.
That is for sure.
You know,
that is for sure.
That they got lazy and they made it all about these silly little wedge issues, which, I mean, some of them matter, but they don't. I understand
these
why
people who are so smart, they fuck up again and again and again. I'm talking about the Democrats here. They can never see it coming, right? It always is completely blindsides them. You know, what's the matter with Kansas? I wrote that 12 years ago. It goes on and on and on to this day.
Well, again, the Republicans are stupider because here's what happened. They've
taken over all these state legislatures.
Kansas elected Sam Brown back. Okay,
this is a guy. By the way, I met him finally.
Who tried to put in trickle-down economics, which is funneling more money to the rich, which was discredited many years ago.
Right.
And of course it tanked the economy, and he got a second term.
Yes.
So sometimes you just got to look at the voters and go, I can't help you.
Fair enough. But so and they deserve all of that. They deserve all of that. But what concerns me in this book, I mean, the folly of the ignorant is sort of what's the matter with Kansas about. This is about the folly of the highly educated. The folly of the Ivy League set.
Right.
I mean, and these people are just as foolish and have made, I mean, even bigger blunders in some ways, and really do not give a damn about average working class Americans.
Nothing stupider than an intellectual. I agree. So listen to this. The kind of wedge issue that used to.
You notice that Bill Maher, in typical annoying Maher fashion, continues to do what I believe many of us have done for decades and continue to do to this day. We make excuses for Democrats by pointing out how much worse the Republicans are. See, whether we are pointing out the Republicans' horrible policies or how unintelligent or hateful we think or we absolutely know, or they make very obvious some Republicans are, liberal voters are, I think, distracted by how bad Republicans are, and we gloss over or we don't pay attention or we make excuses for the sins of the Democratic Party against black people, women, gays, workers, the disabled, every single time. Every election cycle we've done this because we're so conditioned to believe that the Republicans are much worse, so that's a good enough reason for us to vote for Democrats. Now, at some point, we could get away with that for a while to some degree, and I think we did. We dodged pretty big bullets, I think, societally, culturally, certainly economically. It wasn't as bad as we thought, or maybe it was actually. We just didn't realize it at the time, but the presidency of William Jefferson Clinton really ought to dissuade us from being distracted by how bad the Republicans are, to the point where we ignore what the Democrats aren't doing for us anymore. And the fact that their neoliberal policies are just as harmful to us as absolute Republican, hateful, evil conservatism is, their brand of it. Because if you look at the last few Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, and the potential presidency of Hillary Clinton as well, their lives are really a tale of educational achievement. And it's a different kind of merit-based system from what the Republicans use when they talk about hard work and family values. The Democrats just talk about education. They talk about merit based on your ability to gain an education. Because, see, this is what opened up the doors of the world to them. So the Democrats now are a party of people who have gotten where they are by dint of educational accomplishment. And this produces a set of related ideas. Being the party of professionals, they look at the economic problems of working class people and they just see an educational problem. Because they think, well, these people didn't do what I did. And they should go and get advanced degrees, go to the right college, get the high SAT scores, study STEM or whatever. But they're the same people who don't want to push for single payer. So this new batch of Democrats, aligned with the professional class and the corporate class and the global conglomerates, the policies they've enacted in the last few decades bear out this elitist, market-based, neoliberal focus of the Democratic Party now. Starting with, if this is where you want to start, if this is where you believe it begins, although history's proven it's not, but really it's been obvious. It was obvious during the presidency of Bill Clinton. Because the neoliberalism of the Clinton years and the left's glorification of Clinton, which in truth, Clinton just extended Reagan's policies. It has been such a hindrance to the progress of the very people that the Democratic Party has chosen to turn its back on. Because some of Clinton's measures included effectively ending welfare. That just doesn't affect black people, that affects all poor people. Thereby pushing many people into abject poverty, deeper poverty. Pushing the adoption of NAFTA to the detriment of labor and many congressional Democrats. Presiding over privatizations and deregulation of Wall Street. We saw where that got us. All of which reverberate today. With the understanding that Carter initiated the Democratic rightward turn and the abandonment of the New Deal, it then becomes apparent, I hope it is apparent to you, that these neoliberal excesses of Clinton and the Democratic Party are not possible without Carter. Neoliberalism in the Democratic Party wasn't Reagan's fault. He was responsible for his own horrible policies. Neoliberalism in the Democratic Party started with Jimmy Carter. And it has been extended through the Obama administration, which has paralyzed a multitude of meaningful progressive initiatives and transformative economic recovery that we're not getting. And I hope that now we understand that we would never have gotten here without President Carter and his implementation of neoliberal policies. As painful a truth as that is, because I admire Carter too, we will never defeat the thing we fear is going on in our country right now, fascism. We will never defeat fascism. We will never defeat income inequality. We will never defeat the denial of climate change. We will never gain a fair living wage for all working Americans. We will never gain a jobs guarantee. We won't get a free college at any level. We won't get racial, social, gender equality. We won't get any of that. No matter how horrible the Republican Party actually is, we will never get any of the things we want, demand, and deserve as American citizens unless we are honest about the neoliberalism in the Democratic Party and stop making excuses for why we continue to reward them with our votes simply because they're not as bad as the Republicans. I think that depends on who you ask. Thank you for watching me. I hope you have learned a great deal from this episode. There's one more episode of history in this series, and in the next episode I'm going to talk about what neoliberalism touches, all of the issues neoliberalism touch that we face today, and how it looks. What makes these issues worse because of neoliberalism? So I'm going to leave you with this video of one of my favorite intellectuals, Chris Hedges, talking about the neoliberalism of the Clinton administration and the legacy of that neoliberalism in the United States today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me on Brick by Brick. I am Jacqueline Luqman. Have a great evening.
And the weakening of the liberal class. What we lost were the impediments against a rapacious corporate capitalism. And it began probably with the Taft-Hartley Act. I mean, every achievement of the New Deal was rolled back. The last one probably being in 1999, given to us by Lawrence Summers with the destruction of Glass-Steagall, which protected our banking system. There is no banking crisis in Canada because Chrétien did not tear down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks. And by the early 1970s, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, we began to shift from what he called an empire of production to an empire of consumption, which meant that we started to borrow to maintain both a lifestyle and an empire we could no longer afford. We saw the decimation of the manufacturing base in this country and the ability of global corporations to create a kind of worldwide neo-feudalism. There was actually a pretty good story in the New York Times a few days ago about the conditions of workers in China who make Apple products. And what happens is the American worker is now told that they have to be competitive in a global marketplace, which means that they have to be competitive with sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour, or prison labor in China. In that two-part series in the Times, they quote Steve Jobs when Obama asks him why, and there's between sort of subsidiaries of Apple, the 700,000 people are employed, why some of those jobs can't come back, and Jobs apparently curtly answered, those jobs are never coming back. So we lost our radical movements. Our liberal institutions were weak, severely weakened. That's how figures like Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's vice president, 1948, runs for president himself, is tarred with being soft on communism. It's the tactic that Nixon used quite effectively, whether against Helen Cahill Douglas or other candidates, including, of course, McGovern. It becomes a way of shutting out anybody with a conscience, anybody who seeks any kind of redress to the rising social inequities that are taking place in the country. Manufacturing starts to leave. You have a huge rise in deficits. Of course, now we have, I think, the largest deficits in human history, which we can't repay. For me, one of the sort of low points in American history comes with the arrival of Bill Clinton. Clinton, who speaks that traditional language that feel-your-pain language of liberalism, but assiduously serves the interests of corporations. And that becomes the template for the new liberal. The words don't in any way match the actions. So it's Clinton that shoves through NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since Taft-Hartley. It's Clinton that destroys welfare. It's Clinton that deregulates the FCC, so Clear Channel and Rupert Murdoch's News Corp can buy up. I think Clear Channel runs 1,500 radio stations across the country. It's Clinton that deregulates the banking system under Larry Summers. And like Obama, Clinton is, certainly knows where the centers of power lie. And by the 1990s, the Democratic Party has fundraising parity with the Republicans, and by the time Obama runs for president in 2004, the Democrats are getting more.